So this was what was in my calendar. I knew there was something today. In February, we had a conference with the same size as this, and it was called Well 11, and it was about data repositories. A bit more technical than this, and we made an evaluation. And it said, do it all in English next time. We switched between English and Danish. So you English speakers, you shouldn't feel bad because we're talking English today. It's both so we can include you, but it's also just because that's the way people want it apparently. So that's what we're doing today. The evaluation also said invite less speakers and don't invite the system providers. So that's what we did as well. We have 4 very interesting speakers today, and none of them are trying to sell us anything. At least it'll be in a very subtle way. And the last thing was make more breaks. So of course when we have less speakers, we can have a little more breaks, because we are also here to speak with each other and discuss in the breaks. And we're actually trying to incorporate that into the program in a little structured way that I'll tell you about later today. The subject for today is user tracks, and I think we have quite a lot of synonyms for that on our website. Activity data is a word that you're using, David. But I think the common denominator for all of us, our common interest, is that we want to make a better user experience for our library users. So that's pretty much why we're here today, talking about user tracks. And I think when we look back a few years, we have made a lot of user studies, and we have also actually followed what we found in these user studies. One of the latest things and biggest things we have done is really focusing on integrated search, because we found that all users wanted to get all information in one place through one search field. But then you might ask, when we have achieved that and we are on a certain level, what do we do next? What should be the next giant leap in terms of user experience? And as arrangers of this conference, this little one-day conference, we think that there's a lot of potential in user data. And this is also actually a thing that we really don't use that much in our library systems and in the ways we make a search experience for our users. So we also in doubt what to do, if we should really develop something with user data or buy something with user data. What should it be if we should use our money and energy in the right way? So we're really here to get smarter, to know more about this topic, so we will be able to decide after this conference in what direction should we go. So today we'll talk about what is user data, how can we use it. There's also a few comments about that in the evaluation last time actually. Tell me what to do when I get home. What should I do? And we've been talking with our speakers about that. It would be good with a suggestion. What should I do? And of course, we would like to know potential things to be aware of. User data is most of the time very interesting, and it seems like a good idea to use. But there may be pitfalls. It can be maybe even dangerous to just dive into this world of user data and use it uncritically. So we'll try to cover that as well. And as I said, there should be plenty of time for questions and discussion, so it's also really much up to you here to make a good conference, to make this discussion happen. So I'll just encourage you to ask a lot of questions, and if we haven't got time, note them down, because we'll have time later. Yes. So that's the introduction, and I'm very happy to have David Kay to kick off this conference. David Kay has his own consultancy company called SERO, and he has been involved in a few JISC projects since 2008. That's at least what your website says, or your description says. You have been involved in what you call library and education data for 20 years. So that's something. Yeah. And David Kay is also going to introduce us to what is activity data, what kinds of use data can you talk about. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Just a little word about speaking English first. I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed because, not because we're speaking English today, but because mainly you guys do it better than us. I remember coming to Copenhagen a long time ago to meet our good friends Sebastian Hammer and Anna Dick Meister from Index Data, some of you may know them. And we came away saying, they speak much better English than us. We should just give up.
He has an American wife, though.
So, my only problem with speaking English is that I speak too fast. So I'm going to try really hard to speak slower. So forgive me if it's too slow or too fast. It's never going to be right. So, yeah, I'm really representing JISC, which is an organisation within the United Kingdom higher education establishment responsible for information systems in universities and in further education colleges. And JISC runs projects to try and look at where things are going in the near future, not the distant horizon, but in the near future, or in this case where things have gone and we need to catch up, because that may be the case that we are in fact following the leaders here rather than making new waves. So one of the areas that we've been involved in since 2008 is what we call activity data, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about our journey, because our journey, whilst it's a story, is the unfolding, the revelation of a series of issues, a series of opportunities, a series of challenges and choices that I think are useful to you all. None of them are complicated. They're all pretty simple, but there's a lot of them, and so perhaps this will be useful because I set out the list, because I think we have the list. I would emphasise that Tim probably has another list relating to user contribution in this context. My area is to do with, if you like, click streams. It's to do with the area that systems generate, not with the feedback and contributions that users make. And these two things go together, and I'm only really speaking about one of them. So I thought of On the Tracks, and I thought of Library Thing, and I thought I'd look up On Tracks in Library Thing. No, I looked up Blood on the Tracks, to be honest. But I hope it won't be Blood on the Tracks today. But then it made me think, Bob Dylan, don't follow leaders. So there is a danger here that we see other people out there doing this stuff, and we assume that it's portable, transferable directly into the library environment. The same. Whereas we could actually do it better, perhaps, or we could waste a lot of time on something that will never work in our environment. We are not supermarkets. We are not online retailers in the same sense of many of the people we talk about in this context, like Amazon.com. We have to be careful not to follow leaders mindlessly and to think of our own vision, which might be a very special user experience that's to do with what we have in libraries and archives and museums, perhaps, rather than generic goods, insurance policies, cars, or whatever. A friend of mine in JISC used to introduce her talks with these three quotations. I don't have a lot to say about them. The data exhaust phrase, I'm getting a bit tired, because it sounds like this is just waste. This is not waste, this is really valuable data, but I do like the quote from Einstein and the other one, because this is about us applying our intelligence and our library skills and our customer-facing skills to a very, very large amount of data potentially. And if we don't apply those skills, it is a waste of time. This data is very, very large potentially, whether we take it from users or whether we take it from systems. When JISC first considered becoming involved in this, because they're a national organisation, they thought, well, why would we? And they thought every level of what they do, from government policy through to these people, the users, every level of what they do could benefit from this. Could. And the question is to think of the use cases rather than just to steam ahead. Or is it? Here's the first challenge of many. Do we collect data in order to find out what we might do with it? Or do we decide what we want to do and collect data for a specific purpose? And I've heard people argue both ways. Let me give you a very quick example. This is small data, but the University of Cambridge collected data in its virtual learning environment for 5 years without using it. They only had 110 million records. 110 million records is very, very small compared with the volume of activity data collected by global web-scale services. Very small indeed. It's not a computing problem at all. But the question is, do you look at 110 million records and look for patterns? Or do you say, I want to know what resources people are using, and I'm going to drill straight in and ask a question. And I'm going to discard the serendipitous patterns that may emerge from the data. And some of you will naturally say, I need to come with a question to answer, a business question, and others will say, no, let's be scientific. Let's just look at the data and see what stories it has to tell us. We may be surprised. It may not be the traditional library stories that we first think of. You have to do both. So, our work is split into 2 phases. The first phase, for a year and a bit, we looked at possibilities. We just had one project called Mosaic. Well, there was a precursor called Tile. Those of you who are better at English than me will understand the connection between Tile and Mosaic. They're both acronyms, of course. I can't remember what they stand for. It doesn't matter. But Mosaic followed Tile. But it was a single project, really, looking at possibilities. And then this year we have run 9 projects in universities where they have looked at particular hypotheses, particular ideas about how they might use activity data. And the way we started with this is, I guess, a very similar position to anybody who's looked at Amazon, to anybody who's looked at systems that generate user contribution and generate recommendations. Our dream was something like that. This would be great. We titled our first conference almost exactly 3 years ago, next week actually, sitting on a gold mine. The danger of sitting on a gold mine is that all sorts of accidents happen in gold mines. And we were inspired by supermarkets. Everyone is, aren't they? We love supermarkets. I'm sorry about the English brand names here. But, name your own evil supermarket who have loyalty cards. That's the one that's run by a combination of Sainsbury's and a bunch of other nice people. And obviously they have incredibly sophisticated but quite logical. Tesco's our biggest supermarket. I don't know if they're in Europe or not. I guess they're everywhere. They're on the moon, I think. What they're doing is managing to combine the online and the physical. They're managing to manage stock and shelving better through these processes, so it has back-of-house benefits. And forget this user stuff, there are real back-of-house benefits for libraries in terms of collection management from user data, but not the same sort of back-of-house benefits as Tesco. Or perhaps they are. Perhaps there's a just-in-time model relating to e-books, for instance, that might help us in the future. And then we're able to make recommendations from mine and other purchasers and perhaps generate default orders. You should read this next. the University of Huddersfield has actually done that. Well, they've done. People who read this last read this next. It's terrible, isn't it? How unscholarly. But on the other hand, how exactly what people are looking for. So, we all know about Amazon. I don't need to talk about how that works, because we don't know. We guess how Amazon works. And we're probably wrong, but there's some algorithms there that do some stuff, and I guess some of our colleagues have made up their own versions of those algorithms. And actually, you perhaps do need to make up your own algorithms that suit your business, rather than say, how do Amazon do it? We better copy that. But the basic principles of the types of recommendation we can learn from looking at Amazon, from looking at sites like eMusic, from looking at any sites, from looking at something like Library Thing and how Tim pulls things forward. But Amazon are using that combination of what users say, ratings, rankings, recommendations, and the mysterious click streams and purchases and so on. So, our colleague who's perhaps most famous on the internet for this, Dave Patton from the University of Huddersfield, do check him out, developed this vision, and he had worked in supermarket IT before, so he knew a bit about this stuff. Had a vision that we could do very similar stuff, and that's his statement in 2008 with libraries. He's from the University of Huddersfield. So this is the only important slide today, because this is where I'm offering you an ontology. We like that. Or some words, all beginning with the letter A if you speak English. I apologise for the nuances of the language, but I think the distinctions are really quite important. They're important even if you dismiss them and say, that is just garbage. Those distinctions don't matter. Think about these 4 different levels of data that you might collect from a computer. This is without any user feedback loops. They all begin with R, ratings, recommendations, reviews. All these begin with A. It's easy to remember the difference. So this is the stuff off the machine. The machine can tell us about access. Did somebody log on to a service? Did somebody walk through a library turnstile, for example? The machine can tell us about attention. That's the clickstreams stuff. Did people go to a web page? How long did they stay on that web page? How did they navigate? I don't know anything about how this sort of software works, but basically some people have written incredibly sophisticated attention logging software, and other people just take the stuff that comes straight from the system. But, in other words, they went to such a web page. We have no idea what they did, but they followed this route, these breadcrumbs, etc. And we could also, of course, in a future world, follow their physical movements in the library if they had their phone switched on and know which shelves they went to and things. And it's interesting that Sainsbury's, the supermarket, are encouraging people to put their iPads on their trolleys. The theory is they will enjoy television as they go around the supermarket. I think it's to know how they go around the supermarket. But they have a scheme with a little iPad rack on the trolley. Navigation. They don't say that. That's what I think. I'm sure I'm wrong. And then there's the real activity. The transactions, the stuff that your library system has probably been logging secretly or knowingly, to your knowledge, for years. Even systems, I think the III system, Innovative, who claim they didn't have any activity data, we found it in there. Friends from the University College London found it in the bit of black box database they never tell you about. I think there's a US law thing why they perhaps never tell you about it, but I'm making that up now. But the formal transactions, so you can name the formal transactions, a request, some borrowing or the downloading of a thing, the period of loan, and all those things where you have the exact transaction. And then lastly, there's this mysterious thing that I call approval, because it begins with A, and there's probably a better word for it. But these are the proxy things for activity, where you might not have the activity, but you know that activity is implied because they are showing somebody's approval of something. And so if you're saying, how can I kickstart a recommender system with some sense of popularity, you could say, I'll take the lists. I'll take the reading list for the courses and I'll give them a false but reasonable popularity rating, and that might be a number of loans or something that you put in the system or whatever, but that actually you could elevate these up a list because you know that even if you haven't got the data, they definitely are the things that people would have been using. There's a real danger in this, but at some point, if we look at recommender systems, that's what we're doing. So if you're not building a recommender system, would you build these as proxies for historic activity? The lecturer has had this on the list for 20 years. It has to be bad. No. So actually, sorry, just to go back, I think, so this is just an idea. We tried this, by the way, feeding reading listings as proxies into real data, and it was interesting. But forget that, it's just an idea. You have some of that stuff above, you probably have all of that stuff above, but not in the library management system, some of it in the library management system, some of it in the web services that you manage in the search engine, and logging and so on and so forth. So in our first project, how we came to look at activity data was because we thought there are two pain points for libraries in a Web 2 world. One is context and the other is contribution. I'm sure there are many more. I'm sure that the Web 2 world is extremely painful, but we thought leveraging people's context so you can deliver a personal service. I know that you are an undergraduate of history and your current module is the Napoleonic Wars, or whatever. I think there was a battle of Copenhagen somewhere there. But knowing that means that I can perhaps point you not just to recommendations, but actually make of human beings, but make automated recommendations based on the activity of other first-year students who studied Napoleon, or second-year students who studied Napoleon, or PhD students who studied Napoleon. In other words, knowing where you are in the academic tree of life and what your interests are, other than Harry Potter, because there are false drops in this, there is data that can skew the equation. Knowing about your context means that I can do a load better job than Amazon can do, because Amazon only knows about you as one of a whole load of people. And you, if you're in a university, or indeed in a public lending library, know about people with a track record, with expressed interests, with an enrolment, an admissions record, etc., etc. You may not want to use that. Our research with users, and we've only worked with perhaps 100 users in terms of focus groups, says they expect you to use that, because they expect people to use everything they know to give them a good service. And the question is, can you legally do it, and can you ethically do it? Because what you're really saying is, copy everybody else, or are you? You're saying, that's what other people do. Somebody might say, I'm not going to do that. I'll do something else. Thank you for telling me what everybody else did on the course. I'm going to go and look for another resource that's better. So, I don't think we're automatically forcing people into mediocrity. So, we know a lot about people's context in academic institutions and indeed in the public library service. We don't need to know all of these things to make recommendations, but there's a lot to go at that people like Amazon don't have. And then we thought a lot about contribution as well, forget the diagram, but our little phrase was enabling contribution, and our belief was that if you can create recommendations from activity data, it is more likely that people might come and review and comment and recommend and rate, because there's a sense of a community to do it with. So I don't want to try and talk about library thing for Tim, but in the same way that he has groups, we have groups, but actually some of those groups are enforced by the curriculum, by subject choices, etc. Let's use those groups, let's make people aware of the habits that are going on, and perhaps by revealing the borrowing activity and the browsing activity, it will encourage people to reveal their preferences, their choices, their reviews ratings, because there's some context to do it in. It's not a blank piece of paper. students, anybody, hate contributing to blank pieces of paper, I think. So we thought this is where we might head. And this is how we concluded in this project, that, and this is 2000 and right at the beginning of 2010, it would be great, not just to take data from the library, but also recommendations from the virtual learning environment, from learning management systems, recommendations derived from repositories. This doesn't just have to be the integrated library system, the library management system. This is anywhere that patrons use assets, whatever those assets might be. That was our vision. And our vision was also, useless diagram, that we might distribute this in our national community, because surely somebody in the University of Cambridge would be interested in what their peers in the University of Oxford were doing. Now, that's terrible. But you know what I mean, that there's some sense of peers elsewhere in the education system, and perhaps elsewhere in Europe, and perhaps elsewhere in the world, but in a national system there is that sort of interest. And our vision was that we could create a national distributed system or aggregated system of user activity data of all types, and not just from libraries but from other asset management systems. And we know we could do that. And just to find out what might happen if we did, we put out the data from the University of Huddersfield, 13 years of data, because they had pressed the button 13 years ago when they bought a CERSI system. I think it's 13 or 12 years they had. A lot of data. And we asked developers to just do good stuff with that data. And it's really interesting. We had a competition. It was won by an undergraduate from the University of Southampton, not from some professional library person, not by a vendor. It was won by an undergraduate who said, hey, this is fun, and he built a thing called the Book Galaxy. But people built things to improve resource discovery. People built things to improve learning choices. If you like that sort of book, consider this short course for your next course. That was the Open University, which, as you may be aware, in England has a very large number of short courses that you can choose from. So continuing education and how your book choices might help you to find your real interests in pursuing a course. Automated, rather, but could be mediated, part of the conversation of supporting learners to make choices, and then supporting decision making, supporting collection management, valuing the loans for a course. £10 million worth of loans from library stock on the bioscience course. We only spent £1 million. No, you see the sort of thing, and e-journals, that could be really important as we look at new pricing models and with e-books as well. Valuing those things from the activity data. It could be counter-stats. There's nothing mysterious about this activity data. It's what you might do with it, and it's not just supporting the dreadful users. It can be supporting the library machine. So we know people did this before us, even in libraries. Of course, California State put some really interesting stuff together. The Mesure project, or Measure, what do we call it? I like to call it Mesure project. Looked at phenomenal quantities of data to do with e-journal usage, and really took the lid off visualization. You should look at their stuff, and it's legendary, and you probably have before, and you don't need me to tell you about it. But these are the godfather projects, along with one or two in Europe as well. But I think that those two projects, one to do with more books, the other to do with journals, help you to think about the possibilities. And the University of California, the California State interface was quite good for its time, I thought. But beware, beware. This is Big Brother, isn't it? The ultimate activity data collaboration will be this one between these two nice people who are in the room somewhere, I'm sure. They must have a way of being in the room somewhere, and they will be able to help us choose the right things. Indeed, I know that the next media players are not going to have any screens or any user interface, only one button. Well, they'll have three, because you're going to fast forward a little bit perhaps, but play me what I like. Because of course the system will know what I like, And it will also know things like every Saturday morning when you're on that bus, because your phone tells me you're on that bus and it's a Saturday morning, you always try to read a book and stop after 2 minutes and turn on music. So I'm not going to let you read books on that bus. You're going to listen to music and it's always whatever, Bob Dylan. And therefore I'm going to play you what you like, when you like it, at the volume you like it, because I know you on Saturday mornings. And now, we've got to be brave, but there is a sinister side to this, and there is a point where that sinister side is contrary to, if you like, scholarship, contrary to the pursuit of knowledge, contrary to perhaps our fundamental objectives as not just information seekers, but if you like, seekers of truth or whatever, or personal development, seekers of personal development. So be careful. And what we feel we should be careful, you needn't be careful, you can do what you like, it's your English. Yeah, so at the end of the Mosaic project, we did a bunch of stuff. We looked at anonymization, it's not a problem, I don't think. We looked at data models, that's a huge problem. We tried to be too clever with the data models we proposed for collecting aggregated data. Hardly anybody could do it. We asked them to get course codes, study codes, as well as library data together. And the ILS didn't give it them, so they had to go to their friends in the student administration, who weren't their friends at all, and they wouldn't give them the data, etc. So we made it too complicated because we were desperate to get context, and we thought we wanted registration data and all sorts of things together. So we went too far, but we built a rather nice demonstrator of an aggregator service using the obvious technology, Solar, Lucene, that sort of stuff. We should have used the Hadoop as well to make it really go fast, but we only had a few million records, so it didn't matter. And we got some quite good feedback from librarians and students. Useful feedback, but mainly positive. We want this stuff, we can see how it will help us in a number of ways. And this led to some big questions, and we posed these at a conference 2 years ago. Do you need to aggregate stuff to get network effect? Oh, Amazon, there's lots of data. We need lots of universities to put their data together. Actually, we think, and the University of Huddersfield's long trial of this, and other work done in places like Manchester has said, actually, an intensively used collection that is focused on a specific group of people probably generates enough data to be useful, because it's very focused what they're doing. So that data is focused. So on the long tail of Amazon data, you've got a pretty rich resource in a single university. Don't be fooled. And then another thing that we might say is we really felt that context is our winner over these large web scale services. We felt that precision is a real challenge, but then we felt, well, precision in most activity systems, even search, is poor. We like to think it's good, but it's only as good as humans can make it. So the level of precision here in recommendation might also be poor, but it's not going to be a lot worse than where we are, and it might be a lot more interesting. And we also looked at we're questioning what other data sources other than raw library data would we want to use, bearing in mind it's really difficult. So we had a bunch of conclusions here. Students like this stuff, or the 50, 60, 70 we spoke to showed they understood it and they liked it. Librarians and lecturers understood why this might be beneficial. Lecturers are an interesting case here because their reading lists can be exposed as never used, and a whole bunch of stuff that is quite intimidating. That we felt that there is a business case for doing this stuff locally, but that in the UK we should look at the potential for national aggregation, but that local is the place to start because of the concentrated nature of your activity. A small amount of data actually is very good, it's concentrated. And it is concentrated on the courses you deliver, on the themes that you specialise on in your libraries. And lastly, before we move on to the second phase of what we're doing now, we had a conference where we discussed this a year ago, 15 months ago, and 60 people came, very similar to this, 10 more people possibly, from a number of universities, and the emphatic conclusion was we should not leave this to Amazon, Google, whatever. We have an advantage in the data that we can leverage as long as we're sensitive to anonymity and to people's rights. We have an advantage. We will never be giving Google or Amazon that sort of data. We have it, and we can provide a unique and specialist service. And that it really, really is important to understand the range of data that exists beyond the ILS, beyond the library management system. Even just in the library, what else exists? So we put together a bunch of projects. Institutions proposed them, they were not enforced, and they all took place between March and September this year. We had 9, and they were allowed to choose a use case and a hypothesis, an idea that they wished to test. And they ranged over a bunch of stuff because we didn't say library systems, we said anything in university life. So some of them were very interested in things like student retention. Funnily enough, one of the library projects was interested in student retention and explored the connection between use of the library and success in courses. Not a cause and effect, but nevertheless a possible connection. Some of the library projects were looking at optimizing systems, that includes user interface, but particularly interesting for the library projects in the 9, and there were about 5 specific library projects, were recommendation and management of resources. If you like, they go together, it's yin and yang, because in a sense, by collecting this data, you can both improve the user experience and inform collection management and shelving, etc., etc. So, with the University of Manchester, 4 of us were responsible for the synthesis, the bringing together of the conclusions of these 9 projects, which we've only just finished. And we were given a job to do. We were looking for things that were widely applicable. We were looking for skills gaps. We were looking for business cases other than the user experience and collection management, because the people high up might say, I want some kind of improved return on investment. We found it hard to identify those big business cases, but we did conclude it is a core responsibility of the library to deliver the user experience and to manage its collection, and that's a business case in itself. But we thought seriously about how you could express that at a senior management level, because this does sound like messing around with data to a lot of senior managers. And if you say it's business intelligence, they say, oh, I'd rather spend my time on business intelligence to do with recruitment, or business intelligence to do with finance systems. So you've got to persuade them that investing time in business intelligence around libraries is a good thing. And we put together a model as we went on of what themes were emerging, and we did it in a mind map, and in the end we came up with a website that has, and I really recommend this to you, it's not my work, this is the work of the 9 projects. We just pulled the stuff in and edited it a small amount. This website, activity.org, www works as well, you can drop it or use it, has a bunch of useful stuff, I really believe. We've had very strong feedback. It has particularly high-level guidance. There's 12 guides to high-level questions that you need to answer, like what's an event? What sources of data are there in my library, or might there be in my library? The real high-level, where do I start questions. What are the legal implications in UK law, of course, but there's some interesting stuff there. And there are some technical recipes, where the 9 projects came up with 20, 30 things they did, little scripted things they had to do to manipulate data, to visualize data. If you're technical, 1 or 2 of these will be interesting to you. And on the home page, we have a little video which, how am I doing for time?
You have till 10:50.
10:50, yeah. I think I'm going to finish talking, and if there's time, share the video at the end. But on the home page, below what you can see, and some of you are probably looking now because the talk is boring, And if you put your headphones on, you can listen to me speak on the video while I'm talking here. It's only 4 minutes 55. There's a lot of subtitle catchphrases in it. Quite good just for sitting down with people and working through what does all this imply for my library or for my institution. So I recommend that video, not because it's me, that's the bad thing about it. It's a high-level summary. The guides that we have are under these headings. They're all on that high-level guidance page. But I would really strongly recommend that consideration of what events are significant and what library sources I have already of data is really, really important. And the other one I strongly recommend is what's behind a recommendation. And I'm just going to move on to that in a minute. So let's just think. And this is not a complete list. There are some mistakes in it because a number of, you'll see in brackets after some of these, no attribution, a number of these data items are not attributed to an individual in any way, and not traceable to an individual in any way. Remember, we want as much traceable data as possible, even if we then choose to anonymize it. So the more that is traceable, the better. So some of this data is interesting, like people visiting the website, but it's not traceable. Some of it, like turnstile access, is very traceable, and so is circulation and some other things as well. So you could look down this list. I think this way of tabulating your data sources is useful. So forget my list, you have your own. And to say, what would the information, what would the intelligence support? Is this going to help us improve the service? Is this going to help us improve student success? Is this going to help us build a recommender? Why is this data set? Because every one of these data sets will be millions of records. So if you know that it's not going to help you at all, don't go harvesting it. Or that would be the argument, especially if it doesn't have any proper user context, because it won't sit that well with records that can be traced back to users. You make your own list. There's just some of the things that you might have got. I bet you have all those, by the way. And I bet you're probably collecting them all, whether you like it or not. But perhaps we should step back a little bit further and say, just a minute. Let's just think, regardless of the systems, what events take place that it would be nice to know about in a library or in a university or in a public library or wherever. And what do we regard as an event of significance that might actually yield some intelligence? Because you have to take some sort of guess what significant events might be. I take 1 step, 2 steps, not very significant. I fall over the chair and have an accident, very significant. That's in the accident log, not your video of me talking, if you see what I mean. So you've got to think, what are the significant events and where are they logged, rather than just be random. And so here's just a very small example of a bunch of events that, and they're not to do with libraries, they may or may not be significant, but you know, there's one. Student logs onto cash card top-up. That's significant for some people in a university, but probably not significant for the management of learning, unless we make some connection between spending money and not learning, or something like that. But you know, there are some sets of activity data that are readily available in your institution that are not very interesting. Perhaps the Coke machine is, but you know, you've got to think carefully. So my sense is that a little tabulation like this, where you perhaps start with an objective, and you think, who are we trying to help here? And you think, how are we trying to help them? And think, what data might help us to gain intelligence, and what outputs we'd like to make from that data. That sort of thing is quite useful because it helps you to just get into the thinking space. So go back to the start of my presentation. 2 ways of working. One is get all the data, look for the stories it tells you, and the other is identify an objective and see how you might leverage the data to deliver that objective. to the right people. And I think you need both. There are some surprises in the data, but going without any objectives is quite a bold move. I think even Tesco, even Amazon had objectives when they started down this road. They discovered a whole bunch more benefits once they got into it, and opportunities just sprouted, I believe, but I think they knew what their objective was when they started out. I'm pretty positive they did. And then once you've got that list, you can then say, okay, for my objective, there are a bunch of questions I need to then ask. But don't start asking those questions to start with. Think about what you'd like to do, and then ask the detailed questions. Because if I ask the legal compliance question at the start, let's go home there. Because you get scared. If I ask the legal compliance question when I have an objective, some data sets in mind, I can see I can anonymize them, and I go to in England it will be my data protection registrar in the institution, and say, this is the use case. That is a whole different game then. Do you mind if I use activity deleter to do stuff in the library? No. So these are second order things, I think. And our sense is when there's a real use case, people legal people, administrative people, will behave much more sensibly. So the last big thing I've got, and you can't read this, but I strongly recommend that you look at the guide on the site. It's one of the guides. What's a recommendation? That you learn this by heart. No, that you're sure that you understand these sorts of recommendations, and then you can say they're wrong. But this is typically the sort of things we're looking at when we're looking at recommender systems. They might use different language, but these are the sort of games that people are playing with the data. All people who did this also did this. People who looked at this also looked at this. It's a variation. One's to do with real transaction, the other's to do with perhaps more attention. And Amazon does a lot of, you just looked at that, how about looking at this? I find it quite useful, to be honest. And people who did this next or previously looked at this. Thank you. The idea that there is a sequence, that if you're on a course, actually, before you read, I'm a historian, something like E.H. Carr's What is History, you probably should read The Idiot's Guide to the Philosophy of History. And people who read E.H. Carr's What is History then read the volume on suicidal tendencies in a post-Marxist age or whatever. But the point is that sometimes that sequencing is really revealing and helpful, and also with short loan collections may also indicate, if it's people who looked at this then borrowed this, what people borrow as a substitute when the volume they're looking for isn't there. And the University of Huddersfield have proven to themselves that that is useful. That if somebody comes to the library for something on a short loan collection that isn't there, they probably want to go away with something. Whether they're a good student or a bad student, and you can help them in that respect, when you can make them feel helped. And so we go on, people like you, people on your course, people at your level, people of your whatever, but we know about courses and levels in universities and colleges, people like you rated new items that may interest you, comes out of your previous borrowing history and perhaps the borrowing history of others, or the download history, because it doesn't have to be borrowing. And then we move down to some stuff that, again, Dave Patton in Huddersfield has tried, about people who searched using this term typically ended up looking at this term. So people who type, their lecturer may have a phrase. It may be something like remedial healthcare. But actually, what everyone ends up is in a particular subject heading, because there's nothing in the library called remedial healthcare, but everything's under a particular subject heading. And you can see that pattern, and then on the pattern of borrowing that gives you a subject heading, and say, why don't you look under this subject heading? Because everyone who's, that's the pattern. And then lastly, I've just got one more slide to finish, if that's okay, Jens. The following alternative titles I've already mentioned, that's some way of giving people something they could take out. So we've got a bunch of projects that built recommenders, and you can find out about those on our site. I've included in the slide deck because it's quite inspiring, and they've been doing it for longer, stuff from the University of Huddersfield, from Dave Patton, on what they've done with a real recommender service with real students. What they've done with a real recommender service with real students over a long period of time, since 2005-06, that's when they started to put borrowing suggestions in the catalogue. So I've included some slides on that. I've included some pretty pictures on some of our recommender projects that only just give you the names, but some of them are to do with URL data, they're not just to do with catalogue data. But lastly, so lots of pretty pictures in the slide deck. Have I got 30 seconds? That's all right, 30 seconds. Right. We haven't done any technical stuff. I am not technical. I've worked in the software industry for 30 years, but believe me, I am not technical. I've spotted some buzzwords. Big data. We're not at Facebook scale, but this is big data. There are a different set of skills handling hundreds of millions of records, or even tens of millions of records, than a small library catalogue of 2 million records. Those skills are well understood out there in the industry. The databases, which might be NoSQL databases, they might be value pair ways of storing information, but whatever they might be, they're not necessarily the ways that you would think about doing stuff from your background in small library catalogues, or my background in small library catalogues, because they are small. So there's a bunch of stuff about storing and manipulating, statistical techniques, visualization tools. There's a lot of stuff on visualization on our website. A guy called Tony Hurst from the Open University has done some great blog posts on that. But these things are not spreadsheet stuff. These things are not MS Access stuff. These things are a different game that's not terribly hard to play, but it's a different game, and there's a different set of skills involved. Perhaps you might call those skills the data scientist. So you'll see there's a list in my slides of what I think the top 10 questions are, but I just wanted to conclude by just putting up a list of names, because for me there's a bunch of people who are very worthwhile following them and their projects. I particularly commended Dave Patton a number of times, Joe Zucker at University of Pennsylvania with his Metrodot project, this guy who's an amazing link data developer, who's got some good stuff going and got a bunch more funding, Matthew Duckeen, and then projects like the Learning Registry, which aren't in libraries in the US, but are doing some really good stuff, and Steve's just launched some quite interesting things in this area. And on visualization, Tony Hurst at the Open University, he visualizes Formula 1 data. But Formula 1 data is very similar to library data. Usage data, there's a heck of a lot of it. So I might leave you with those.
David Kay, thank you. So, before we go out and grab a quick coffee and a piece of fruit, we actually have a few minutes for questions for David, and I'm sure that there are some questions. Yeah. I might have a warm-up question then.
Okay.
This seems to be very interesting stuff, by the way. And it seems that you have been doing a lot of experiments in these JISC projects. So what now? The recommendation engines you have been building, are they being used now, or are they going to be in practice? Or was it just an experiment?
I'm sure that the Open University will take this forward. I think the University of Manchester, which have a very interesting set of special collections in the John Rylands Library, will take this forward. Huddersfield are clearly a long way down the route. The University of Lincoln will take it forward. 4 very different universities now. That's only 4 out of 140. But our sense is that people have grasped this potential. I think it will take them 2-3 years to really mobilise behind it. But I think people are now more confident and clear of what's involved, whereas in the first project, people were interested but actually thought it was beyond them. So I think we've reached the stage where people know they can do this.
Yeah.
You make programs in open source so others can use your experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at the technical recipes and project things on our site, there's a number of references to source code that you can use. So this is, and JISC is a big supporter, as some of you may know, of open source. So people were obliged, where possible, to make stuff openly available. And also open data. So we have some open data sets here that you could experiment with. If you want to see some data, it's not just Huddersfield, we've got a very large set of resolver data that is really interesting in this respect across 90 UK universities. There are references to these data sets and to the source code where relevant in the on the website when you drill down to the projects. Absolutely. How reusable it is, I think it's for getting ideas. I'm not sure the code itself will be explicitly reusable. That's always the case, isn't it?
Yeah. So?
Yeah, you were talking about a lot of input data from different sources. Do you think you can build this engine and make it run for a year automatic, or do you think you have to do some manual stuff continuously in order to get it running?
So the people who built things so far, I think only Huddersfield, because their journey is longer, has automated this stuff. Mainly people are exporting from one system, importing to their activity database, if you would, and that is a process that they're undertaking on a regular basis. So there are real issues here, but there are issues to do with the openness or not of some of the systems that people are collecting the things from, and there is a workload involved. Yeah, but I am confident you can automate this stuff. It's whether you would make that the priority at the start. But I think they all say prove it at the start and then automate later. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But do you think if you start this way of doing things, do you have to? How big is it becoming for a library to get involved in this? How many people do we have?
Yeah, real numbers. How expensive is it? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, if I say I'm guessing, I have a good idea. My impression is that, let's take Huddersfield, because they're using turnstile data, they're using resolver data, they're using library catalogue data, and they're also trawling search expressions and things like that, so a lot of data. I think that they have possibly somebody working 10, 15 hours a week on it, having established the system. So that would be somebody who's a top systems librarian, who has some data skills, but I don't think it's more than half a job, but that's still expensive, I think. Or is it? What do we spend on playing with user interfaces and websites and all sorts of other UX stuff? A lot more than that, perhaps. I don't know. Is that a lot?
Perhaps not.
Yeah, Michael, you got a question?
How big is the Huddersfield? I'm not from the university, so what is critical mass?
All right, so Huddersfield has about 15 to 20,000 students, depending on how you count them. The Open University, who I refer to, who had a very successful experiment, have 220,000 students. Truthfully, technically, it makes no difference because the tools that people are using are for big data, and they're tools that are open source, largely going back to things like Sober and Lucene and so on and so forth. and Apache Jackrabbit and things. But would this work for a small institution by itself? So if you had just 1,000 learners, would they be generating enough data to make the effort? If they were all in the same single area of study, the school of Skoda cars or whatever, possibly if they were massively distributed over many subject areas in tiny groups, no. And also you would have anonymity problems because you have groups of 5 or groups of 10, and once you're down to groups of 5 and 10, even if you remove all personal references, you still know that the guy who borrowed Nietzsche and the car repair manual is that anarchist on the back row. So small groups of people are very dangerous. So once you get down to a small school or whatever, I think you can't do this. But it's rare to have a school of science.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we just have time to get out there, grab a cup of coffee or tea, grab a piece of fruit, and come back here. So that's 3 minutes, really. Okay?